Next up, let me introduce Dr. Peter Verschueren, Medical Product Director for Materialise, giving the engineering perspective. I'll give a little background on Peter. Has a master's in electromechanical engineering, specializing in biomedical engineering, and then went on to do a PhD in biomedical engineering from the University of Leuven. He's been at Materialise for 7 years and is currently the Medical Product Director, and has interest in medical imaging, image-based reconstructions, 3D printing technologies, and applying them in a clinical field. His role puts him in charge of products for soft tissue applications and responsible for some of the bony application work as well. So welcome, Peter.
So as said, I'll be talking about engineering aspects of anatomical models, or at least the Materialise perspective that we have on that. I'm a full-time employee of Materialise, as already said. So 3D printing of anatomical models. The very first model that Materialise actually did was way before I was there, back in 1992. We did a hip case, but as Ryan also pointed out here, as Justin also pointed out here, we see that over the last couple of years there's a lot of both scientific publications but also popular press releases that show that 3D printing of these anatomical models is out there. It's a thing, it's happening, but the evidence is lacking. Now, I'm not going to, the whole goal is not to discuss specific case studies here. The goal is to look at evidence. But I am going to discuss, for the sake of the exercise, one hypothetical patient, which is patient Murphy. And what we see is that patient Murphy is a 1-year-old male, very complex congenital heart disease, double outlet right ventricle would be a perfect example. And the cardiologist of patient Murphy does not have any 3D printing experience, but a couple of weeks ago at a reception, she met the professor of mechanical engineering who said, look, we have built our own 3D printer. We have built our own software in order to create 3D reconstructions of these models. So we're set up to do 3D printing for you, create anatomical models. Brilliant. Cardiologist said, let's do that. So what she did is she had this patient in for an MRI. Now you have to know that these small children, they have to get full sedation when they have to go into an MRI scanner because you have to be completely immobilized for quite a long period of time. But what she did not really think of is that her standard scans have a slice distance of about 5 millimeter. And she sends that to the professor. He says, yeah, we really cannot do anything with those images. So patient has to come back, again, has to go under full sedation, takes the new images, and those images, okay, they're good now. They burn them on a DVD, and one of the students of the professor then takes his bike, goes to the hospital, gets the DVD, goes back to the operating, goes back to the university, and there they say, okay, bring on that medical software, dear professor, so that we can get started on this. Turns out that this software that they have is a combination of MATLAB, Microsoft Paint, 3 products that start with free and then something, and 2 products that start with open and then something. And that these students actually have to rewrite a bunch of the code. The PhD student that has written the code has washed his hands clear off the code and says, no, I'm gone, I don't want anything to do with it anymore. So these students, very passionate group, they go in, but about 2 days later, this is what they look like. So they put in a lot of time and effort to get through, to plow through, and okay, they get ready after these 2 days for their first 3D print. They're very happy with it. Unfortunately, it looks a bit like a spaghetti heart, their very first try. So they run into quite a few problems. Another 2 days later, finally, they're able to print their first 3D printed model. Looks good, blood volume is perfectly there. They go to the physician then, but the doctor says, well, why is it not a hollow model? All the models that I've seen before are actually hollow models. My cardiac surgeon, they work on hollow models, so what's up with that? Second thing is, and where is the VSD? Students look a little bit at each other and they have no idea what a VSD is. They don't know the pathologies. So physician has to explain, okay, VSD is a ventricular septal defect. It's actually one of the main things that is wrong with this patient's heart. So these students don't know. And one of the students says, oh yeah, I thought something like that, but I just colored it in. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was just a mistake on the images. So Another 2 days later, they redo the model. It's a hollow model now. Everyone's happy. And they go into the multidisciplinary team meeting, the cardiologist, the radiologist, so yeah, all the physicians that need to decide what are we going to do with this patient, come together, use the model, and they actually try to create a pre-cut patch. Yeah, so one of the options for this patient is to put in a patch. They sew in the patch so that they can make a conduit essentially for that VSD and solve the problem. Go to surgery, turns out, yeah, patch is too small, does not really fit. Okay, not too big of a deal. So they make a patch during the intervention, what they normally do. And the surgery is successful. Everyone's really happy. They have been able to use a 3D printed model. They made the right decision. But during the feedback session, the physicians, yeah, they bring up this patch. They said, yeah, it didn't fit. So one of the postdocs goes back, checks the code that the students have made, and it turns out that there was a scaling error. Yeah. So on the 3D printed model, the X direction was scaled 80%, and the Y was scaled 120%. So the model was off. Okay, they made the right decision, but the postdoc did not say anything because, well, these surgeons, they have tools and sometimes a temper, which, yeah, you don't want to mess with. So, again, this is a hypothetical story. I do want to stress that each individual line of error is something that we have come across in the past. So we haven't seen all of these potential things, but each line of this is something that, yeah, in our experience we have seen happening in the field. Yeah, so it's not that hypothetical. Now what's important is that the intended use for this model is clinical planning. They want to use this model to think, what are we going to do with this patient? We have multiple options. Let's use this piece of information to see what we're going to do with this particular patient. So it's clinical planning, and with clinical planning comes risk. And ultimately, the engineering is how do we control that risk? What if, based on that wrongly scaled model, that patient would have died? Yeah, would have been a very different story. What if there's multiple patients, and what if you make 3 models, but you've switched 2 of them? Yeah, and you bring the wrong model to the wrong surgery. How do you avoid that? What if your printer is badly calibrated? And a risk on a whole different level, not a patient risk, but what if the student took the images, the patient name is still on there, he talks to the press because he's very proud of what he did, but he actually mentions the patient's name without any consent, without the family knowing, so a risk of a whole other matter. Now, I'm painting a bit of a doom and gloom story here, but the message I want to bring is it's not that we should all stop doing this because there are risks. No, the message is, okay, there's risks, but engineers control the risk. So you have to have a risk management system in place. And luckily, there are institutes, such as the FDA, that allow tools, that allow collaboration, that help you think along in the process of how to control those risks. And the starting point is, and this is just a definition from the FDA website, is what is a medical device? So is an anatomical model used for planning, is it a medical device? Well, if you look at the definition, then it says a medical device is an instrument, apparatus, implement, so it's, yeah, a thing, you could say, in easy words, that is on a certain list, says the first point. And the second point, which is the crux of the definition, it's intended in the diagnosis or the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. Yeah? So we as Materialise, we consider even something as simple as an anatomical model as a medical device. And this definition of the FDA, it's, I don't know whether it's co-defined, but if you look at the definition of a medical device from the World Health Organization, so from a global perspective, it's almost exactly the same. Yeah, it's also a contraption that is used in the planning or the planning, the diagnosis or treatment of disease. So, patient risk mitigation, and also here, regulatory institutes such as the FDA, they provide tools in order to assess the risk and in order to and to mitigate the risk. So, a risk charter is basically an Excel sheet that says, okay, look, we're going to go through the worst case scenario. We're going to use this patient Murphy story. We're going to talk to clinicians about everything that could go wrong. We're going to quantify that. We're going to quantify how high is the chance of it happening, what is the risk, what is the outcome of the, what is the problem for the patient. What can we do about it? And then, again, in a quantified manner, we want to have all these numbers in green. Yeah? So we've thought about everything. We have set up systems to avoid that risk. There's things like you have a design plan, you have to have design inputs, outputs, verification, validation, and ultimately that leads to work instructions. Yeah? It leads to standard operating procedures. It leads to people that are trained. You have to be able to prove that they're trained, so that they're qualified, so that they know what they're doing, and that you can mitigate those risks. Okay, so that's the first part of the presentation. The second part is about, okay, what specific risks are there? Now, there's no magical formula. I cannot give you like a book that says, okay, if you do this, then you're fine. It's important that you think as a company, as a hospital, about your own process. You make your own risk charter, you do your due diligence, but there are components that do come back, and that's these four that I want to briefly address. The first one is imaging. So if you look at the imaging, yeah, it's important that you start off with good images, of course. You need to have pathology-specific protocols that you use that are readily available for the radiologist, that the physicians can send to the radiologist if they want to have a 3D print. And even if you use the perfect protocol, it can still go wrong. There can be artifacts, the patient could have moved during the scan. So what you also need is criteria that trained people can use to say, yes, this is good, or no, sorry, this is not good enough, we cannot make a good model, but also guide or implant from that. The second thing is the 3D reconstruction. Yeah, you have to go and use software that is able to take the medical images and create a virtual model that you can send to your printer that is accurate and that is able to be used for the purpose. So you need a certain level of validation and documentation. You could have software that has a regulatory clearance. And here, this week specifically, there was an article from the FDA in which anatomical models, yeah, there is the current perspective on anatomical models, on devices, on 3D printing in general was released this week. So I think this would be interesting to further discuss. But our Materialise's take up to this point so far is that, okay, you can use uncertified software, but you have to validate it yourself. Yeah? Now, one of the discussion points is here that the FDA finds it very important that you use a 510K cleared software, so that is an aspect that's maybe part of the later discussion. So you need to segment, you have to have the right tools to do that, and you have to have the right people. You need to have, you cannot pick a random engineer and do it. They need to be trained, they need to understand what medical images are. Once you have a 3D model, there's often still steps that need to happen. There might be smoothing, there might be some aberrations, you want to maybe add certain components or colors or structures. You need to think about the minimal wall thickness if you want to print those kind of things. So ultimately, it's important that you can do an assessment of that. So your whole process, you should be able to visually assess that on the images. So here is an example of a simple femur model where two engineers used the same software and where the one had the result, which looks here like the red line, would be the cut through the STL on this image level, and the yellow line is another STL. Both of them look exactly perfect, fine, ready to print, but there is a fundamental difference between the two. Yeah. So that assessment, that visual assessment between the two and looking where am I actually with my final STL versus the images, that is very crucial. And there are groups that do full validations on that, which is also the way it's supposed to be. So a paper from 2008 shows for femur models where they actually they had a group of cadavers, they did a CT scan of those cadavers, and they compared that with, so they had from those cadavers the soft tissues removed, and they did an optical scan, which gives you a very high resolution, very high resolution 3D result. And they compared the two, and they found that, okay, so if you use a specific protocol, that you can get your femurs to be generated with mean absolute accuracies of up to 1/5 of the voxel size and a root mean square error of half a voxel size. Yeah, so it does mean that if you follow a good protocol, that you can get very good results on your 3D models. The 3D printing aspect is the next one. Many things to think about. There's material selection, does it have to be flexible, does it have to be rigid? So yeah, you have to think about what's my intended use again, what's ultimately the thing that we want to do with this model. One particular example from our own group at Materialise is for our flexible material for cardiovascular purposes. We did a test where we reviewed literature, we looked at what is the distensibility of arterial tissue, and we had our material tested on that as well. So we made arterial specimens in our flexible material, they were put on a pump system, and we looked at the distensibility. So if you put physiological pressures on it, is it going to distend like real arterial tissue would? And there we were able to conclude that yes, indeed, we are in the range of that arterial tissue for a specific thickness, wall thickness range of our material. Printer hardware is a component that's quite overvalued. Yeah. We get in touch with quite a few hospitals, and there's many hospitals that say, okay, we want to do 3D printing, we're going to buy an expensive piece of equipment, and then we'll 3D print. But it doesn't work that way. It's important that you build up knowledge first. Yeah. There is the dirty little secret of 3D printing that it's not just a push-button solution. It is still something that you need to have knowledge and skills for. Another component that's often forgotten is finishing. Post-processing is often forgotten. The fact that you need hardware, the fact that you need personnel in order to clean up these 3D printed models is something that's important. And ultimately, you have to decide, do I need to do an individual part accuracy assessment? The final component is a management and communication layer on top of that. So you have to somehow get those images throughout your institute if you're in a hospital, or from hospitals to companies. So you need to take into account HIPAA compliance, patient privacy, things. You also need to have final approval from the physician. Yeah, it's always the physician that needs to approve and say, okay, yes, this is the model that I want. And you need to communicate about that. So the way that you do that is something you have to think about. And traceability is another aspect. So you have to be able to at least put a unique label that is kept in your records for the anatomical model so that you don't mix up. And if something goes wrong, that you also can go back in and look who has segmented this, who has done the 3D reconstruction, what were the parameters, on what machine was it built, and what were environmental conditions during that day. The latter two are more important potentially for guides or for implants, but also for anatomical models, it's something that you could track. So I said that there was a very recent publication from the FDA radiology group where our current understanding of that is that anatomical models are indeed medical devices, but there are, if they are considered as a printed copy of the CT, that there are certain exemptions. So it's still something that we need to clarify further on what does that exactly mean. So we do look forward to further discussions potentially within this group on that. 510K cleared software is an important component that is specifically mentioned in the article. So yeah, we do need further clarification on this, but we are happy that anatomical models, which was which there was little guideline on, that it's on the radar, that it's something that the FDA is also taking into account now. So as a conclusion, 3D printing of anatomical models, it's happening. It's supporting those clinical decisions. We still lack the evidence, but that's what we're here for today. It does influence diagnosis and treatment. And the patient risks need to be mitigated. So you have to do your due diligence in the different steps throughout the process. You need to have processes in place as well, and you need to have the right people, the training to do that. As this is an engineering talk, no good engineering talk is finished without a somewhat nerdy but true quote. So 3D printing holds great power, but with that power also comes great responsibility to just do the things right. Thank you.